December 18, 1944. Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium. The frozen earth trembles beneath boots caked in frost and mud. Oberst Heinrich Müller steadies his binoculars against the edge of his command post, scanning the American positions across the valley. Behind him, panzer commanders huddle around tactical maps, their breath rising in white plumes. They've been winning. 3 days into the offensive, German armor has split the American line like paper. But now, something is wrong. The morning sky erupts with whistling steel. Müller expects the familiar thud of shells cratering the earth. Instead, the air itself explodes. Above the tree line, above the foxholes, above his men. No impact, no warning. Just instant devastation raining down from nowhere. His radio crackles with desperate voices reporting impossible casualties. The shells aren't hitting the ground. They're detonating in midair 30 feet above German positions, turning entire companies into ghosts. Müller lowers his binoculars. His hands shake. The Americans have done something that defies every principle of artillery he learned in 2 wars. By autumn 1944, Nazi Germany stood with its back against the wall. The summer had been catastrophic. Allied armies liberated Paris in August. Soviet forces crushed Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. Romania switched sides. Finland sued for peace. The 1,000-year Reich was collapsing in months. Yet Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat. In the map room of the Wolf's Lair, surrounded by generals who no longer believed in victory, he conceived one final gamble. A massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the same route that brought triumph in 1940. The objective was audacious: split the British and American armies, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, force the Western Allies to negotiate, buy time for new secret weapons to turn the tide. His generals protested. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt called it impossible. The Wehrmacht lacked fuel, lacked air cover, lacked reserves. But Hitler was beyond reason. He demanded the offensive. By December, Germany had secretly assembled a force of over 400,000 men, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,600 artillery pieces. They positioned them in the dense Ardennes, where Allied intelligence believed the terrain too difficult for armor. The Americans held this quiet sector with green divisions resting from combat or inexperienced units training for future battles. The 80-mile front stretched thin. Some positions had only 4 men per 1,000 yards, perfect for breakthrough. German tank commanders received their orders with grim determination. They would spearhead 3 armies through the weakest point in the Allied line. The 6th Panzer Army would strike in the north near Monschau and Elsenborn. The 5th Panzer Army would hit the center at St. Vith. The 7th Army would protect the southern flank. Speed was everything. Reach the Meuse River in 48 hours, Antwerp in 7 days. The commanders knew their Panthers and Tigers outgunned American Shermans. Their veteran crews had survived years of combat. Their new King Tigers were nearly invulnerable. They laughed at American artillery. Traditional shells required direct hits or lucky timing. German tankers had dodged thousands of rounds. Artillery was a nuisance, not a threat. What they didn't know was that across the Atlantic, American scientists had spent 4 years and $1 billion perfecting a weapon that would rewrite the rules of artillery forever. At precisely 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the Ardennes forest erupted in flame. 2,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along the American line. Shells screamed through the pre-dawn darkness. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. American positions disintegrated under the bombardment. Communications severed. Command posts collapsed. Green troops huddled in foxholes as the earth convulsed around them. Then came the tanks. Out of the morning mist rolled waves of German armor, infantry following in white winter camouflage. The offensive achieved complete surprise. American units scrambled to respond. Within hours, German spearheads penetrated miles into Allied territory. Entire regiments found themselves surrounded or overrun. The northern shoulder of the attack targeted Elsenborn Ridge and the twin villages of Rocherath and Krinkelt. These positions controlled the road network essential for any German advance toward Antwerp. The Wehrmacht threw elite SS Panzer divisions at the American defenders. The 99th Infantry Division, combat virgins who had been in Belgium less than a month, suddenly faced Hitler's finest troops. The 2nd Infantry Division, veteran but exhausted from the Hurtgen Forest, rushed to reinforce them. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, moved into blocking positions. For 2 days, American troops fought desperately to hold the northern shoulder. German armor pushed through villages house by house. American tank destroyers traded shots with Panthers at point-blank range. Artillery on both sides fired constantly. But the German guns followed doctrine perfected over 5 years of war. Time-fused shells detonated at predetermined altitudes based on calculations. Contact-fused shells exploded on impact with ground or structure. Both required precise mathematics and luck. Foxholes provided protection. Forest canopy scatter. Defragments. Reverse slopes offered sanctuary. Artillery was deadly but survivable if soldiers knew the craft of staying alive. German commanders had mastered this calculus. They maneuvered armor to minimize exposure. They used terrain to shield advancing infantry. They trusted that American artillery, however numerous, operated under the same physical limitations as their own guns. This assumption had held true through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and the drive across France. It would hold true no longer. In August 1940, a secret British delegation arrived in Washington carrying blueprints for radical weapons research. Among the documents was a prototype for an impossible idea, an artillery fuse that could sense its proximity to a target and detonate automatically without impact or timing. The British called it the Bonzo fuse. They had proven the concept but lacked the industrial capacity to mass produce it. American scientists took up the challenge. Dr. Merle Tuve led Section T of the National Defense Research Committee from a laboratory at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory. The technical obstacles seemed insurmountable. They needed to fit a miniature radio transmitter and receiver into a 5-inch artillery shell. The device had to withstand forces of 20,000 times gravity when fired. It had to survive spinning at 500 revolutions per second. It had to function in temperatures from 100 degrees to 50 below zero. It had to be powered by a battery that activated only after firing. Most impossibly, it had to work with vacuum tube technology in an era before transistors. Researchers hand-built each component. They miniaturized vacuum tubes to the size of a thumb. They developed wet cell batteries sealed in glass ampules that shattered on firing to activate the circuit. They designed a radio system that transmitted continuous signals and measured the return bounce. When the reflected signal reached critical strength, indicating the shell was within 70 yards of a target, the circuit triggered detonation. The shell exploded in midair, scattering shrapnel across a lethal radius that no foxhole could protect against. By January 1942, prototypes were ready for testing. The United States government designated the Proximity Fuse Project among the highest classification levels of the war, equivalent to the Manhattan Project. They gave it the deliberately vague designation VT Fuse, standing for variable time, to mask its true function. Speaking the words proximity or variable in connection with fuse became a classified act. Over 100 factories across America manufactured components. Workers assembled devices they didn't understand for purposes they weren't told. The Crossley Corporation in Cincinnati led mass production. RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and Sylvania built vacuum tubes. National Carbon Company developed batteries. Daily, sample fuses from each production lot were flown up to 3,000 miles to the Naval Proving Ground at Dahlgren, Virginia, for quality verification testing. Every test firing was documented and analyzed. Researchers worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. By 1943, factories produced 40,000 fuses daily. By war's end, 22 million had been manufactured. The cost per unit dropped from $732 to $18. The total program cost exceeded $1 billion 1940s, roughly $15 billion in modern value. Security protocols were absolute. The Navy restricted use of VT fuse shells to naval vessels only, ensuring that duds would sink into the ocean where enemies couldn't recover them for examination. When the fuses first proved themselves in combat in January 1943, shooting down Japanese aircraft over Guadalcanal, the Navy censored all reports. Sailors were forbidden to discuss what they had witnessed. The secret held. German soldiers first encountered the weapon as an inexplicable nightmare. Lieutenant Karl Schmidt of the 277th Volksgrenadier Division recorded his experience in a letter never sent. "We heard the shells coming as always. We pressed into our foxholes as we have done 1,000 times. But these shells did not strike the earth. They exploded above us while still in flight. There is no defense. The men in the hole beside mine were torn apart by fragments that fell from the sky like steel rain. We found pieces of them scattered across 20 meters. No crater, no impact mark, just blood and snow. When prisoners were interrogated after capture, they spoke in confused, horrified terms about the American artillery. They called them devil's shells, miracle weapons. One described feeling as if God himself was throwing thunderbolts. Another reported that his entire platoon, 32 men in prepared positions under forest cover, ceased to exist in a single barrage of a dozen shells. They couldn't comprehend the mechanism. German artillery experts who examined American firing patterns concluded the enemy had developed impossibly accurate time fuses or were using some form of remote detonation. They never imagined a self-contained proximity sensor. German tank commanders, accustomed to American artillery being an annoyance rather than a decisive threat, discovered their infantry support evaporating under barrages that ignored terrain masking. Panzer crews watched helplessly as following grenadiers were shredded by airbursts they couldn't predict or avoid. The psychological impact devastated morale. Soldiers who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front and in Normandy reported that nothing compared to the terror of shells that exploded overhead without warning. There was no learning curve, no adaptation, no tactical counter, just death falling from an empty sky. American artillerymen had trained for years in the brutal mathematics of indirect fire. Forward observers calculated range, azimuth, and deflection. Fire direction centers computed trajectories accounting for wind, temperature, air density, and propellant temperature. Gunners adjusted elevation and loaded fuses set to specific time intervals. Even with radar assistance and mechanical computers, hitting a target required skill, experience, and luck. The introduction of VT fuses transformed their craft into something approaching sorcery. Suddenly, they didn't need to guess burst height or calculate time of flight. The shell itself decided when to explode. Fire missions became simpler and infinitely more lethal. Set fuse to VT, aim in the general direction of enemy concentrations. Fire. The shells would find their killing height automatically. Battery commanders who had struggled to achieve 10% effectiveness with time fuses now saw success rates above 70%. Observer. S reported devastation beyond anything they had witnessed with conventional ammunition. One forward observer with the 99th Infantry Division described a German company attempting to cross open ground near Elsenborn. Before VT fuses, such a target would require multiple ranging shots followed by fire for effect with uncertain results. With proximity fuses, the first salvo caught the entire formation. 96 bodies were later counted in an area the size of a football field. The men looked as if they had gone through a meat grinder. Artillerymen came to view their VT-fused shells with an almost superstitious reverence. These were the rounds that couldn't miss, the ammunition that made every shot count. In a war where material superiority often decided battles, the proximity fuse represented American industrial and scientific power at its absolute peak. Traditional artillery operated under constraints known since the invention of gunpowder. Contact fuses required direct hits or near misses to be effective. Time fuses needed split-second accuracy in calculation and perfect conditions. Terrain provided sanctuary. Hills blocked shells. Forests absorbed fragments. Deep foxholes offered protection. Soldiers learned to read incoming fire, judge shell trajectories, and find safety in ground contours. Artillery was deadly but survivable for troops who mastered battlefield geometry. The proximity fuse shattered these ancient assumptions. It created a new category of weapon. The tree burst, an airburst shell detonating 20 to 50 feet above the target. From this height, a standard 5-inch or 105mm high explosive round scattered thousands of steel fragments across a lethal radius exceeding 100 yards. The fragments fell at steep angles, penetrating foxholes from above. Forest canopy that once shielded infantry now became a triggering surface. Shells exploded in the treetops, multiplying the fragmentation effect as splinters of wood joined the metal shrapnel. Log-reinforced bunkers that stopped ground-burst shells offered no protection against fragments falling vertically. Reverse slopes, the artilleryman's nightmare and the infantryman's salvation, became kill zones when shells detonated above rather than beyond the crest. The tactical implications cascaded through every aspect of ground combat. Defenders in prepared positions lost their primary protection. Attackers crossing open ground faced near certain death. Armor advancing without infantry support became vulnerable when their supporting troops disappeared under airbursts. Artillery spotters using new SCR-584 radar could now deliver devastating fire on targets they couldn't even see, hitting enemy forces beyond visual range or beneath forest cover with precise ion that seemed supernatural. The Germans had no counter-tactic. Their defensive doctrine assumed artillery followed physical laws that no longer applied. American artillery units began receiving mission profiles that would have been impossible weeks earlier. Fire on enemy assembly areas hidden in forests. Suppress anti-aircraft positions dug into hillsides. Eliminate infantry in fortified villages without destroying the structures. The VT Fuze made each mission achievable with a fraction of the ammunition previously required. War is as much a contest of will as weapons. Soldiers who believe themselves vulnerable in any circumstance lose the cohesion necessary for effective combat. The proximity fuse inflicted a psychological wound on German forces that statistics alone cannot capture. Interviews with prisoners after the Battle of the Bulge revealed a pattern of trauma. Men described emerging from barrages in a dazed state, unable to process what had happened. They reported feelings of helplessness unknown even on the Eastern Front where Soviet artillery came in massed waves. The randomness of survival haunted them. In a conventional barrage, skill mattered. Soldiers who kept low, chose positions well, and stayed alert had better odds. Against VT-fused shells, survival was pure chance. A man in a perfect foxhole died while his comrade standing in the open lived because fragments fell elsewhere. The arbitrariness broke something in veteran troops. German commanders noticed the degradation immediately. Units that should have pressed attacks hesitated. Soldiers who should have held positions retreated at the first incoming rounds. Infantry refused to follow tanks into areas under American artillery observation. Wounded men spoke of comrades simply giving up, walking into enemy fire rather than enduring another barrage of the devil shells. The 277th Volksgrenadier Division, tasked with taking Elsenborn Ridge, lost combat effectiveness not from casualties alone, but from collective psychological collapse. After 3 days of VT-fused bombardment, the division could barely function. Interrogators noted that German soldiers captured near Elsenborn seemed relieved to be prisoners, grateful to escape the invisible executioner in the sky. One panzer commander, interviewed years after the war, recalled his rage and despair watching his infantry shredded by American artillery while his tanks remained untouched. We had the superior armor, we had the tactical advantage, we had momentum, and then their shells began falling from nowhere, and our men died in ways we could not prevent. How do you lead soldiers into fire they cannot shelter from? The psychological dimension extended beyond the immediate battlefield. As word spread through German units that American artillery had gained some new terrible capability, resistance stiffened in some quarters and collapsed in others. The inconsistency created command chaos. Officers could no longer predict how their men would perform under fire. For the first 3 days of the German offensive, the proximity fuse remained locked away under the strictest prohibition. Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower had personally forbidden the use of VT-fused artillery shells on land targets. The risk of a dud falling into German hands was too great. If enemy scientists recovered even one intact fuse, they might reverse engineer the technology or develop countermeasures. The weapon had to remain secret. But by December 18, 1944, the situation had become desperate. German armor had penetrated miles into American lines. The northern shoulder at Elsenborn Ridge was holding but barely. The central sector around St. Vith was collapsing. In the south, Bastogne was about to be surrounded. The weather remained terrible. Thick fog and heavy clouds grounded Allied aircraft. American troops fought without air support against an enemy who knew this was their last chance. Eisenhower faced a decision that would define the battle. His artillery commanders pleaded for authorization to use the VT fuses stockpiled at ammunition depots throughout the theater. 200,000 posite shells, the code name for proximity-fused rounds, sat ready for deployment. The weapons could turn the tide, but releasing them meant accepting the risk of compromise. Eisenhower calculated the stakes. Lose the Ardennes battle and risk losing the war's momentum. Protect the secret but sacrifice thousands of American lives needlessly. Or unleash the weapon, accept the compromise risk, and give his soldiers every advantage. On December 18th, he authorized immediate deployment of VT-fused artillery for ground targets throughout the Ardennes. The order went out through encrypted channels to every artillery battalion on the northern shoulder. Fire missions were already planned. Now they would be executed with ammunition that guaranteed devastating results. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions had absorbed 3 days of German assaults. SS Panzer troops fought through Rocherath and Krinkelt with fanatical Dieters. My nation. American lines bent but didn't break. Artillery batteries of the V Corps fired continuously, expending conventional ammunition at unsustainable rates. Forward observers called mission after mission, trying to break German attacks before they reached American positions. The weather limited observation. Heavy forest masked German assembly areas. Time-fused shells achieved inconsistent results. Now everything changed. At 6:15 a.m. on December 19th, artillery batteries across the northern sector loaded VT-fused shells for the first time against ground targets in Europe. Fire direction centers received coordinates for German positions in the forests east of Elsenborn. Gunners set fuses to VT mode. The first salvo of 105mm howitzers fired simultaneously. The shells arced through the morning fog. No forward observer could see the impact. They didn't need to. The shells sensed the forest canopy and detonated 30 feet above German positions. The effect exceeded every prediction. The German 277th Volksgrenadier Division had been preparing a dawn assault on American positions south of Elsenborn Ridge. 3 battalions assembled in forest cover, approximately 1,500 men organized for a coordinated attack. Standard tactical practice. The trees provided concealment from observation and protection from artillery. Battalion commanders synchronized watches. The attack would begin at 6:30 a.m. At 6:15, they heard incoming shells. Veterans pressed into cover. Some shells burst in the trees above. This happened sometimes with poorly timed fuses. Then the forest exploded. Every shell detonated in perfect airbursts, 30 feet above the ground, 50 feet, 20 feet. The entire canopy became a killing field. Shrapnel and wooden splinters scythed through the assault formations. Men crouching behind trees died from fragments falling vertically. Soldiers in foxholes were hit by metal descending at steep angles their positions couldn't deflect. The barrage lasted 6 minutes, 400 rounds. When it stopped, the 277th Volksgrenadier Division no longer existed as an effective fighting force. Casualty estimates later exceeded 40%. Wounded men lay scattered across 2 square kilometers. Those still mobile retreated in disorder. The planned assault never materialized. American observers noted the German attack failed to develop. They requested additional fire missions on suspected enemy positions throughout the northern sector. Every mission employed VT-fused ammunition. By the end of December 19th, German commanders realized something fundamental had changed. Radio intercepts captured panicked German communications. Units reported impossible casualties from American artillery. Commanders demanded explanations. Soldiers refused to advance through forests under American observation. One intercepted message from a regimental commander to division headquarters conveyed the crisis. Artillery falling on our positions detonating without impact. All troops in open or forest taking massive casualties. Cannot maintain offensive operations under these conditions. Request immediate tactical guidance. No guidance could be given because German artillery experts had no answers. On December 20th, the 12th SS Panzer Division attempted to flank Elsenborn Ridge through forested high ground northeast of the American positions. The attack involved 2 panzer battalions supported by a regiment of panzer grenadiers. American artillery observers spotted the German movement. Fire missions engaged the enemy columns. VT-fused shells detonated above the forest roads. German armor continued advancing, but their infantry support disintegrated. Panzer grenadiers who survived the barrages refused to follow the tanks. Armor without infantry is vulnerable. American tank destroyers and bazookas teams ambushed the exposed panzers. The attack collapsed. On December 21st and 22nd, German forces made final attempts to break through Elsenborn Ridge. Each assault met coordinated American artillery fire using proximity fuses. The Wehrmacht fired back with conventional ammunition. They still possessed numerical advantage in guns. but effectiveness had shifted decisively. American batteries achieved 70% success rates. German batteries struggled to reach 30%. The mathematics of attrition turned brutal. By December 23rd, the northern shoulder had stabilized. Elsenborn Ridge remained in American hands. The critical road network stayed under Allied control. The entire German 6th Panzer Army offensive in the north had been stopped. Historians would later debate whether conventional artillery could have achieved the same result. The numbers suggest otherwise. American forces were outnumbered. They held defensive positions but lacked reserves. Without the force multiplication provided by VT fuses, the German assault might have broken through. The proximity fuse didn't win the Battle of the Bulge alone, but it made victory possible. The immediate tactical consequences rippled across the entire Ardennes battlefield. As German units throughout the northern and central sectors encountered VT-fused American artillery, their offensive capabilities degraded rapidly. The 12th SS Panzer Division, elite troops who had fought savagely through Normandy, lost cohesion after 4 days of proximity-fused bombardment. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division attempting to seize St. Vith found its infantry unable to exploit armored breakthroughs. The 116th Panzer Division pushing toward the Meuse discovered that American artillery could interdict their supply columns regardless of terrain masking. By Christmas Day 1944, the German offensive had stalled across most of the front. Not from lack of courage or determination, but from attrition inflicted by a weapon they couldn't counter. Casualty statistics tell part of the story. German forces suffered estimated 80,000 casualties during the Battle of the Bulge. A significant percentage came from American artillery. Exactly how many died specifically from VT-fused shells remains impossible to calculate because the Germans didn't understand what was killing them. Wounded prisoners interrogated by American intelligence officers provided testimony that filled classified reports. One sergeant from the 326th Volksgrenadier Division described his company reduced from 120 men to 34 effective soldiers after 2 days near Elsenborn. We thought American artillery was firing some new type of shrapnel shell. The shells burst above us like firecrackers. Nowhere was safe. A lieutenant from the 9th SS Panzer Division recalled watching his platoon destroyed while attempting to cross open ground south of Krinkelt. We were in dispersed formation as doctrine requires. The American shells came in groups of 6. Each group exploded over us while we ran. It was like trying to run through a rainstorm of steel. Only 4 of us reached the other side. German artillery officers attempted frantically to understand the mechanism. Initial theories suggested incredibly precise time fuses, but recovered American shell fragments showed no evidence of sophisticated mechanical timing. Some German experts proposed the Americans had developed acoustic fuses that detected sound. Others theorized magnetic sensors triggered by steel helmets and equipment. A few came close to the truth, suggesting radio waves, but couldn't conceive of the miniaturization necessary to fit transmitters into artillery shells. None imagined the proximity fuse's actual sophistication. The Germans never developed effective countermeasures because they never understood what they were defending against. Allied forces exploited their advantage ruthlessly. Artillery doctrine evolved in real time. Forward observers learned that VT fuses performed best against troops in forests, in foxholes, in open ground, basically any CI. Circumstance except deep underground bunkers. Fire missions increased in frequency and decreased in duration. Why fire a 10-minute barrage with time fuses when a 2-minute barrage with VT fuses achieved better results? The strategic impact extended far beyond the Ardennes. Hitler's gamble had failed catastrophically. The offensive consumed Germany's last mobile reserves, its remaining fuel stocks, and its dwindling ammunition supplies. The Wehrmacht destroyed 2,600 irreplaceable armored vehicles. The Luftwaffe lost thousands of aircraft in desperate ground support missions. Germany gained nothing. The Americans, British, and Canadians held everywhere that mattered. By mid-January 1945, Allied forces had pushed German troops back to their start lines. The failed offensive left Germany defenseless against the Soviet winter offensive launched January 12, 1945, and the Allied crossing of the Rhine in March. The VT proximity fuse's role in this outcome earned recognition at the highest levels. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, whose Third Army relieved Bastogne and drove into the southern flank of the German penetration, wrote to the Army's Chief of Ordnance, The funny Fuze won the Battle of the Bulge for us. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding Allied forces in the northern sector, reported to Winston Churchill that American artillery had demonstrated effectiveness unprecedented in modern warfare. Even Eisenhower, typically cautious in his praise, acknowledged the proximity fuse as decisive. The weapon's success in the Ardennes ended the prohibition on its use elsewhere. American artillery units in Italy, France, and later in the Pacific received authorization to employ VT-fused ammunition freely. The shell became standard issue. Production continued at maximum capacity. By war's end in Europe, May 1945, American factories had produced 22 million proximity fuses. In the Pacific theater, the VT fuse had already proven itself against Japanese aircraft. Kamikaze attacks that should have devastated American fleets were blunted by anti-aircraft guns firing proximity fuse shells. Success rates jumped from under 30% to over 70%. Naval commanders credited the fuse with saving countless ships and sailors. Now ground forces fighting in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa had access to the same advantage. Japanese troops entrenched in caves and bunkers still required direct assault, but Japanese forces in forests, on hillsides, in open defensive positions, faced artillery that found them regardless of cover. The psychological impact on Japanese forces mirrored what Germans had experienced. They called it the weapon that sees. German prisoners, transported to camps in Britain and the United States, discussed the mysterious American shells among themselves. Allied intelligence monitored these conversations. Prisoners speculated endlessly about the mechanism. Radio fuses were suggested frequently, but most dismissed the idea as technically impossible. One captured German artillery officer calculated that fitting a radio transmitter and receiver into a shell would require miniaturization beyond current technology. He was correct. What he didn't account for was American industrial capacity and scientific determination. The same forces that produced the atomic bomb had produced a weapon that pound for pound and dollar for dollar killed more enemy soldiers and altered more battlefield equations. The proximity fuse represented something profound in the evolution of warfare. It was a weapon that succeeded not through greater explosive power or longer range, but through intelligence. The shell could sense its environment and make decisions. In a war dominated by machines, this device introduced a form of mechanical awareness that seemed almost alive. Scientists had given artillery a kind of perception. The shell knew when it approached a target. It acted on that knowledge. This concept would echo through military technology for the next 80 years. From guided missiles to smart bombs to autonomous drones, the principle remained the same. Weapons that sense, decide, and execute without human intervention in the moment of action. The German tank commanders who laughed at American artillery in the early days of December 1944 represented a worldview that was dying. They believed in steel thickness, gun caliber, crew training, tactical doctrine. These factors still mattered, but they no longer guaranteed victory against an enemy who combined industrial supremacy with scientific innovation. The Wehrmacht had excellent tanks, experienced crews, sound tactics. They lost anyway because American shells could see. In the frozen forests of Belgium, beneath winter skies heavy with fog, the nature of artillery changed forever. Soldiers would no longer find safety in foxholes dug deep. Terrain would no longer provide sanctuary. Forest cover would no longer shield concentrations. The ancient bargain between artillery and infantry, the balance that had existed since cannons first appeared on European battlefields, shifted decisively. The artilleryman's dream had been realized. A shell that found its own killing height, that maximized its lethal radius, that turned every round into a precision weapon. For the German soldiers experiencing it in December 1944, it must have seemed like sorcery or divine punishment. For the American artillerymen firing the shells, it was vindication of faith in science and industrial power. The proximity fuse cost $1 billion to develop. 22 million units were produced. It shortened the war. It saved Allied lives. It won battles. And it taught a lesson that militaries would never forget. Victory belongs not just to the brave or the skilled, but to those who harnessed knowledge itself as a weapon. The shells that fired around corners were real. They existed. They killed. And they changed war forever.